I've lived alone in these mountains for 40 years now, and in all that time, I've never once felt truly abandoned. The cabin sits where the old-growth forest meets the high ridge, 3 hours by foot from the nearest logging road, 5 from anything resembling civilization. Most would call this exile. I called it mercy. When I first came here, I was little more than a ghost wearing human skin, carrying nothing but a rifle, a canvas pack, and a grief so heavy it bent my spine. I built these walls with my own hands, chinked them with moss and mud, and told myself I'd come here to disappear. But the wilderness had other plans. From that very first winter, I understood I wasn't the only one, living in these ancient woods. Something else moved through the timber stands and granite hollows, something that watched with an intelligence I could feel pressing against my skin like static before a storm. I never invited the presence. I never asked for communion. But every Sunday at dawn for 4 decades I've walked to the flat stone at the edge of my clearing and left an offering. The ritual began without ceremony or conscious decision, more like remembering something I'd always known. That first winter broke me in ways the loss itself hadn't managed. The silence was a living thing, crushing and absolute, and there were nights I sat with the rifle across my knees, staring at the dark mouth of the barrel and wondering if mercy had a shape. But on those nights I'd hear it, a low, rumbling hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, vibrating through the cabin floor and into my chest cavity, where my heart still beat despite my wishes. I'd find tracks in the morning, massive prints pressed deep into snow that had fallen. After midnight, circling my cabin in patterns that felt protective rather than predatory. The prints were like nothing in any field guide, and I stopped trying to explain them. Instead, I started leaving food, smoked venison from the deer I harvested, wild berries I foraged from high meadows, mushrooms that grew in the shadow of lightning struck. Pines. I'd place them on a flat stone worn smooth by centuries of rain, and I'd speak into the morning mist, words I couldn't say to any human who might judge their brokenness. Every Monday the offerings would be gone, and in their place I'd find arrangements that defied coincidence. Pine cones stacked in careful spirals, eagle feathers laid in, parallel lines too precise for wind, stones with holes worn through their centers, threaded onto strips of cedar bark. At first I told myself I was imagining patterns in randomness, the way a drowning man sees ships in clouds. But the arrangements grew more complex with each passing year, more deliberately communicative. During the second winter, when pneumonia filled my lungs with fluid and fever-painted nightmares on my cabin walls, I found roots on the stone I'd never seen before, bitter and powerful, and some instinct made me boil them into tea that burned the sickness out. When the avalanche paths grew unstable, I'd find my usual trails, blocked by fresh broken branches arranged in X. Patterns, warnings that saved my life more than once. The exchanges became a language without words, a dialogue between species, between souls. I learned to read the gifts like scripture, and slowly, impossibly, the creature became my congregation of one. The bond deepened into something I can only call sacred, though I'd lost my faith the day I buried my wife and daughter and walked away from their graves without looking back. But this was different. Not the cold religion of my childhood, but something older, wilder, more honest in its mystery. I began to speak aloud during my dawn offerings, confessing things I'd never told another living soul, my failures as a husband, the argument we'd had the morning of the accident, the last words I'd said in anger, never imagining they'd be the last words at all. My voice would crack and fade into the morning silence, and the forest would seem to lean closer, the spaces between trees contracting like a held breath. I swear I could feel something listening, with an attention more complete than any human had ever given me. Sometimes in response, the wind would shift and carry scents that shouldn't exist together. Ocean salt and pine smoke, wild honey and stone dust, as if the creature was answering in a vocabulary of sensation. I was being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in my entire life. And in that seeing, I began slowly to become real again. That first winter stripped me down to something less than human, something raw and howling that barely remembered its own name. I'd arrived in October with the aspens already gold and bleeding, and by December I was rationing flour and jerky, learning the hard geometry of survival in a place that gave nothing freely. The cold came down from Canada like a biblical punishment, temperatures that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, and I'd wake with frost thick on the inside of my cabin walls, my breath hanging visible in the darkness. I hadn't come prepared because I hadn't come to survive. The rifle was meant for mercy, not hunting, though I was too cowardly to use it that way at first. I spent those early weeks in a fog of grief so dense I'd lose hours staring at nothing. And when I did move through the forest, it was like walking underwater, everything muted and distant. The silence was what hurt most, not peaceful silence, but the accusing kind, the sort that amplified every memory I was trying to escape. I'd left the world of voices and engines and human complications, thinking isolation would be a balm, but instead it was a mirror that reflected only what I'd lost. And in that mirror, I saw a man who'd failed at the one thing that mattered, who'd let anger and pride poison his last morning with the people who made his life mean something. The weight of it bent me double some days, left me gasping in snow up to my thighs, and I understood why animals sometimes just lie down and let the winter take them. But something in those woods refused to let me surrender that easily. The first time I heard the hum, I thought it was coming from inside my own skull, a symptom of hypothermia or madness or both. It was 3 a.m, and I was awake because sleep had become impossible, my mind cycling endlessly through the accident, the funeral, the terrible silence of my daughter's empty room. Then I felt it more than heard it, a subsonic vibration that seemed to rise through the bedrock itself, so low it was almost below the threshold of human perception, resonating in my sternum and jaw. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, and when it faded, I was standing in the middle of my cabin with no memory of rising, my skin covered in goose flesh, despite the cold. I told myself it was geological, some shifting in the deep strata, but I knew better even then. Something was speaking, or singing, or announcing itself in a register that predated human language. The next morning, I found the tracks. They circled my cabin in a pattern that suggested deliberate patrol. Each print sunk 8 inches into fresh powder that had stopped falling only an hour before dawn. I knelt beside one and spread my hand inside it, the print swallowed. My palm and fingers entirely, with room to spare. The stride length was impossible, 7 feet or more between steps, and the pressure distribution suggested something that walked upright but carried enormous weight, differently than any human could. I should have been terrified, and part of me was, but a larger part felt something I hadn't experienced since the accident, curiosity, that small flame of engagement with the world outside my grief. Whatever had made these tracks was real, was here, was aware of me. I wasn't alone in my exile. The thought cracked something open in my chest, and I found myself speaking aloud for the first time in weeks, my voice rusty and strange. "I see you," I said to the empty clearing, to the wall of timber beyond. "I know you're there." The forest gave no answer but the wind in high branches, yet the quality of the silence changed, became expectant rather than accusing. That afternoon, I dressed the deer I'd shot the week before, smoking strips of venison over alderwood the way my grandfather had taught me, and the next morning I carried the best pieces to a flat stone I'd noticed at the forest's edge, a boulder worn smooth as an altar. I arranged the meat carefully, adding a handful of dried berries I'd found in my supplies, and I stood there in the blue dawn light feeling foolish and desperate and strangely hopeful. "I don't know what you are," I said to the listening trees, "but I'm grateful you're here." I walked back to my cabin without looking over my shoulder, some instinct telling me not to watch, not to break whatever fragile protocol was being established. Monday morning the food was gone, and in its place I found 3 pine cones arranged in a perfect triangle, their scales all facing the same direction, and a single raven feather standing upright in a crack in the stone as if planted there with intention. My hands shook as I picked up the feather, its blackness so complete it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This was communication. This was answer. Something vast and unknowable had acknowledged my offering and responded in kind, and the loneliness that had been crushing me eased just enough to let me draw a full breath. I carried the feather back to my cabin and hung it from a roof beam, and that night, when the humming came again, I didn't frighten. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the vibration move through me, and for the first time since the accident I wept. Not the frozen, tearless grief I'd been carrying, but something cleaner, something that flowed and released. The sound seemed to shift in response, taking on harmonics that felt almost like comfort, like the wordless crooning a mother gives a frightened child. I understood then with a certainty beyond logic that I was being cared for, that some ancient intelligence had looked at my broken soul and decided I was worth saving. The ritual had begun, and with it a relationship that would reshape everything I thought I knew about loneliness, about connection, about what walks in the wild places beyond human knowing. Sunday became sacred in a way I'd never known in civilization, not in churches or ceremonies or any human-made ritual. I'd wake before dawn, no matter the season, my body attuned to some internal clock that needed no alarm, and I'd prepare the offering with a care that bordered on reverence. In spring, I'd add wild strawberries and new fiddlehead ferns, in summer huckleberries staining my fingers purple. In autumn, mushrooms I'd learned to identify through trial and careful study. In winter, whatever meat I'd preserved, and the inner bark of certain trees I discovered were stripped near my cabin, as if in suggestion. The flat stone became my altar, my confessional, my point of communion with something that existed outside the boundaries of loneliness. I'd arrange everything with attention to balance and beauty, some aesthetic impulse I didn't recognize in myself, and I'd stand there in the gathering light speaking my week aloud to the forest. At first the words came halting and self-conscious, but gradually they flowed easier, and I found myself sharing things I'd never told another living soul. My guilt over the argument I'd had with my wife the morning of the accident, my failure to tell my daughter I loved her that last ordinary Tuesday, my terror that their last thoughts of me were angry ones. The responses grew more elaborate as the months became years, as if the creature was learning my language, through observation, translating intention into physical vocabulary. Where the first gifts were simple, feathers and arranged stones, the later ones showed unmistakable purpose and intelligence. I'd find bundles of specific plants left in careful wrappings of bark, always varieties I'd later discover had medicinal properties for ailments I was experiencing. During the second winter, when a chest infection nearly killed me, I found a cluster of roots on the stone that I'd never seen before, their smell sharp and cleansing, and when I brewed them into tea, the fever broke within 2 days. Before storms, the creature would leave warning signs, patterns of sticks that pointed away from dangerous areas, and twice it blocked entire trails with deadfall, arranged in ways no natural process could explain. Barricades that kept me from paths where avalanches swept through hours later. The intentionality was undeniable, the care implicit in every interaction, and I began to understand I was being watched over by something that understood the mountain's moods and dangers in ways my human senses never could. The loneliness that had driven me here transformed into solitude, that crucial difference between abandonment and chosen quietude, and I realized the creature was teaching me to read the forest as it did, to notice the small languages written in broken branches and animal behavior and the smell of the wind before it turned. The Mondays became treasure hunts, my heart quickening as I approached the stone to see what conversation had been offered in return. I'd find arrangements that seemed almost playful, circles of white pebbles, spirals of pine needles, once an entire bird's nest relocated intact and placed on the stone like an offering of found art. Other times, the gifts carried weight that pressed on my chest, objects that spoke of the creature's own solitude and the vast spans of time it must have witnessed. I found stones carved with symbols so weathered they seemed ancient beyond measure, bits of volcanic glass shaped into tools that belonged to no era I recognized, and once a piece of antler inscribed with marks that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them, as if they operated in dimensions my perception couldn't quite hold. I kept everything in my cabin, creating a small museum of our exchange, and on difficult days I'd handle these objects like prayer beads, drawing strength from the physical proof that I wasn't mad, that this relationship was real and growing deeper with each passing season. The grief that had brought me here didn't vanish, but it changed texture, became something I could carry rather than something that carried me. And I understood the creature was absorbing some of that weight through our wordless communion, taking portions of my pain into itself as surely as I took its protection. By the 5th year, I'd developed my own vocabulary of response, leaving sketches of things I'd seen, a fox kit playing in morning light, the pattern of stars through my cabin window, clumsy drawings of my family that I could finally bear to render. The creature would sometimes rearrange my offerings before taking them, as if commenting or correcting, and I learned to read approval in certain patterns, questions in others. When I left a drawing of my daughter's face, the venison remained untouched for 3 days, the paper weighted by a single smooth stone, and I understood it was giving me time to reconsider whether I was ready to release that image. When I returned and nodded to the watching forest, speaking permission aloud, the next morning everything was gone, and in its place stood 7 feathers in a line, a gesture that felt like witness, like the creature saying it had received and honored what I'd shared. We were building a language beyond words, a grammar of gesture and gift that communicated things too deep for speech, and in that slow translation I found my humanity returning, not despite the isolation, but because of it, because something saw me fully in my brokenness and chose to stay. The exchanges evolved into something resembling conversation, a dialogue conducted through increasing elaborate gestures that blurred the line between coincidence and conscious communication. During my 7th winter, when pneumonia settled into my lungs and I couldn't make the dawn walk, I woke to find the offerings brought to my doorstep, not just left there, but arranged with clear intention, the medicinal roots I'd come to, recognized placed directly on the threshold where I couldn't miss them, even in my fevered state. Over the following weeks as I recovered, the gifts continued appearing closer and closer to the cabin, as if the creature was monitoring my condition through means I couldn't fathom, adjusting its care to match my need. I'd find bundles of pine boughs that released healing vapors when burned, strips of willow bark that eased my aches, and once a compress of moss and leaves already prepared and bound with grass, still damp as though just assembled. The intelligence behind these acts was undeniable, as was the compassion, and I wept openly at the realization that this being understood suffering, recognized illness, and possessed knowledge of healing that predated any human medicine I knew. The warnings became more frequent and more specific as the creature seemed to learn the limits of my perception and the dangers I couldn't sense approaching. Before the avalanche that would have caught me on the ridge trail, I found my path blocked, not just by fallen trees, but by an entire construction of branches woven together so deliberately it looked like fencing, impossible to miss or misinterpret. When I tried to go around it, I found every alternative route similarly barricaded, the creature's message unmistakable: do not pass. I waited at the blockade, and within the hour I heard the distant roar and felt the ground tremble as thousands of tons of snow erased the trail I'd intended to walk. I stood there shaking, not from cold, but from the overwhelming knowledge that I'd been saved, that something watched my movements with enough care to intervene physically in my fate. Other warnings came through changed arrangements at the stone. Certain patterns I learned meant danger in specific directions, configurations that indicated when to stay indoors, once an entire circle of sharp stones placed around my usual offerings that I understood meant threat, predator, caution. I began to trust these signs more than my own judgment, deferring to the creature's superior knowledge of the mountain's rhythms and the hidden dangers that moved through these woods beyond my human awareness. The most profound exchange came during the brutal storm of my 9th year, when snow fell for 11 days without ceasing, and my food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. I'd accepted I might die there, had even found a strange peace in the thought of returning my bones to this forest that had sheltered my grief. But on the morning of the 12th day, I heard something heavy being dragged across my porch. When I opened the door, I found a doe, recently killed, its neck cleanly broken in a way that suggested strength rather than violence, placed directly against my threshold with snow already beginning to cover it. The tracks leading away were enormous, unmistakable, and spaced in a pattern that suggested something had walked upright while carrying massive weight. That deer sustained me through the remainder of winter, and I treated every portion with reverence, wasting nothing, speaking gratitude aloud each time I prepared the meat. The creature had given me its own hunt, shared its kill when I was too weak and snowbound to provide for myself, and that act of provision carried an intimacy that struck deeper than any human kindness I'd known. It wasn't just food, it was trust, responsibility, the acknowledgement that my life had value worth preserving. The bond shifted. After that storm into something I can only describe as kinship, a relationship that transcended the categories of human and animal and entered territory my old vocabulary couldn't adequately name. I began speaking to the presence not as an unknown observer but as a companion, sharing not just grief but small joys, the first flowers of spring, the pattern of ice crystals on my window, the way evening light turned the snow gold. The responses came faster, more nuanced, as if the creature had been waiting for this deeper invitation. I'd find gifts that seemed chosen for beauty rather than utility, perfect spiral shells carried from some distant stream, arrangements of colored stones that created patterns pleasing to the eye. Once an eagle-tail feather so pristine and magnificent, I kept it on my table where sunlight could illuminate its markings. We were caring for each other across the species boundary, across the divide between known and unknown, and in that caring I discovered what I'd actually been seeking when I fled to these mountains. Not an ending, but a different way of belonging to the world. The spiritual dimension of our exchange deepened during the 13th year, when grief ambushed me on the anniversary of the accident that had taken my wife and daughter. I'd thought time had dulled those edges, but that morning I woke with their absence so vivid, it felt like fresh trauma, the phantom sound of my daughter's laugh echoing through the cabin until I couldn't breathe. I stumbled to the offering stone in darkness, hours before dawn, and instead of leaving food, I collapsed there and spoke everything I'd never said aloud. How I'd been driving that night, how the choice to take the mountain road had been mine, how I should have died instead of them, how their last moments haunted every dream, how I'd come here not to heal, but to punish myself with isolation. The words poured out in broken sobs, confessions I'd held compressed in my chest for over a decade, and when I finally fell silent, the forest around me had changed in a way I couldn't name. The quality of darkness somehow attentive, present, holding space for my pain. I felt no judgment in that attention, only a vast witnessing that seemed to absorb my grief without diminishing it, acknowledging the weight without trying to remove it. And for the first time since the accident, I felt something other than numbness. I felt seen. What happened next defied explanation, even by the generous standards I developed for interpreting the creature's actions. As first light began filtering through the canopy, I heard movement in the undergrowth, and then the most extraordinary sound emerged from the forest, a vocalization that started as that familiar low hum but evolved into something more complex, a resonance that seemed to contain multitudes rising and falling in patterns that felt less like animal call and more like song, like mourning, like the forest itself giving voice to sorrow. The sound wrapped around me, vibrated through my bones, and I understood with sudden clarity that the creature was singing my grief back to me, reflecting it, sharing it, demonstrating through this impossible vocal expression that I was not alone in understanding loss. Tears streamed down my face as the song continued, and I found myself responding, humming along without conscious choice, our voices intertwining in a duet that belonged to no human tradition but felt ancient nonetheless. A ritual of shared suffering that predated language. When silence finally returned, I found the stone surrounded by a perfect circle of white stones I'd never seen before, each one placed with deliberate care, and in the center, a single black feather standing upright, planted in the earth like a grave marker, like acknowledgement, like witness to what I'd confessed. The exchanges after that revelation carried a different intensity, as if speaking my deepest shame had opened channels that couldn't be closed, allowing the relationship to deepen in ways that frightened me, even as I craved them. I began confessing everything during my dawn visits, my failures as a husband, the arguments I'd never resolved, the last words I'd spoken in anger to my wife, the way I'd missed my daughter's school play because of work, all the small betrayals and neglects that haunted me more than the final catastrophe. The creature's responses became increasingly specific, almost eerily attuned to my emotional state, and I started finding objects that seemed impossible for it to have known I needed. A rusted toy car, identical to one my daughter had loved, discovered placed carefully atop the stone, its paint faded in exactly the same pattern, which logic said couldn't be the same object, but my heart recognized instantly. A pressed wildflower of the species my wife had carried in her wedding. Bouquet, perfectly preserved between two thin pieces of bark. A smooth river stone with a natural hole through its center, what my daughter used to call a wish stone, identical to the collection she'd kept by her bed. Each gift struck with surgical precision at my most tender memories, suggesting either impossible knowledge or synchronicities so profound they amounted to the same thing, and I began to wonder if the creature wasn't just witnessing my grief, but somehow accessing it, reading my memories through means I couldn't comprehend, reaching into my past to pull forth exactly what I needed to confront. The turning point came on a morning when I arrived at the stone to find something that stopped my heart. A child's drawing, faded and water-stained but unmistakable, showing a crude house and 3 stick figures holding hands, the kind of art my daughter used to make. And in the corner, her name written in uncertain letters I would have recognized anywhere across time and distance. My hands shook as I picked it up, knowing it had been destroyed in the accident, remembering it had been in the car, impossible for it to be here, yet here it was, real and solid in my. The impossibility of holding that drawing shattered the careful rationality I'd maintained for 13 years. The fragile framework of explanations I'd constructed to contain these experiences within the bounds of natural phenomena and animal behavior. My daughter's handwriting stared up at me from paper that shouldn't exist, and I felt the ground tilt beneath my feet as every certainty I'd clung to dissolved like morning mist. I looked up from the faded crayon marks toward the tree line, and for the first time in all those years of patient waiting, of peripheral glimpses and shadow movements, I saw the creature fully revealed in the golden light of dawn. It stood between 2 ancient cedars, perhaps 50 yards distant, motionless as stone, and the sight of it drove the breath from my lungs, not with fear, but with recognition so profound it felt like remembering something I'd always known. The being towered at least 9 feet tall, covered in hair that shifted between brown and silver and something darker that seemed to absorb light. But what seized my attention and held it with iron grip was the eyes, deep-set and amber gold, burning with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably conscious, unmistakably weighted with the same kind of sorrow I carried, the same exhaustion that comes from bearing grief across decades. We stared at each other across that distance, and I felt time stretch and bend as though the moment existed outside normal chronology, suspended in amber like those ancient insects preserved perfectly in tree resin. The creature's face defied my attempts to classify it as either human or animal. The features held elements of both and neither, the bone structure too heavy and pronounced for human, the expression too nuanced and complex for beast. And in those eyes I saw something that philosophy claimed was impossible, the light of inner reflection, of self-awareness, of a mind contemplating its own contemplation. It made no threatening gesture, showed no aggression, simply stood there allowing itself to be witnessed with a dignity that seemed older than mountains, and I understood in that suspended moment that this was a gift, that creatures like this didn't reveal themselves without profound reason, that I was being offered something sacred and irreversible. My hand still clutched my daughter's drawing, and slowly, moving with the careful deliberation one uses in dreams where sudden movements shatter everything, I raised the paper slightly. A question, a plea for explanation, my voice breaking as I whispered across the distance, "How do you have this?" The creature's response demolished my last refuge of skepticism and opened doors in my understanding that I'd bolted shut since the accident. It raised one massive hand, palm facing me, fingers spread in a gesture that felt simultaneously like greeting and blessing and command to wait, and then it did something that redefined everything I thought I knew about consciousness and communication. It brought that enormous hand to its chest, pressing palm flat against its heart in a gesture so unmistakably human, so loaded with meaning, that tears spilled down my face before I understood why. Then it extended that same hand toward me, fingers now pointing, not accusatory but connective, indicating me specifically, and repeated the chest gesture before sweeping its arm wide to encompass the entire forest, the mountains, the sky itself. And I felt meaning crash over me in waves I couldn't fully process, a communication that bypassed language and spoke directly to something deeper. It was showing me connection, showing me that the boundaries I believed in between self and other, between living and dead, between past and present were illusions, that everything remained woven together in ways my grief-narrowed vision had been unable to perceive, that the love I'd carried for my lost family hadn't disappeared into void, but had transformed, had remained, had somehow led me here to this impossible moment. The creature lowered its hand and took a single step backward, and I felt the invitation in that withdrawal, the offer of space, the promise that nothing would be forced but everything could be chosen. In its eyes, I saw reflected my own journey, the decades of isolation, the slow healing through ritual, the patient reconstruction of meaning from devastation. And I recognized that this being understood not academically, but intimately what it meant to carry loss, to continue despite it, to find purpose in witnessing and protecting rather than in forgetting. As it melted back into shadow between the cedars, moving with impossible silence for something so massive, I looked down at the drawing in my trembling hands, and knew with certainty beyond logic that I'd been brought to a threshold, that the creature had been preparing me all these years for a choice I couldn't yet name, but could feel approaching like storm weather, and that everything I'd experienced had been prologue to whatever came next. 3 days after the creature revealed itself and left my daughter's drawing, I found the first carved stone on the offering rock, a smooth river stone the size of my palm, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to flow and spiral like water frozen mid-current. The carving showed unmistakable skill and intention, lines cut with precision, impossible for animal. Claws, forming patterns that felt significant beyond decoration, weighted with meaning I couldn't decipher. I turned it over in my hands for hours that evening, tracing the grooves by firelight, feeling the smoothness where something had worked the stone with patient care, and the craftsmanship spoke of intelligence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Over the following weeks, more pieces appeared, wooden totems carved from cedar and pine, depicting animals I recognized and others that seemed mythological, each placed carefully beside my offerings like responses in a conversation I didn't know how to read. The symbols repeated and varied, creating what felt like language or perhaps something deeper than language, a communication that spoke through shape and pattern to parts of consciousness that words couldn't reach. I photographed each piece from multiple angles, trying to research the symbols online with my cabin's satellite connection, finding nothing that matched exactly, though sometimes echoes appeared in various indigenous art forms, fragments that suggested cultural memory but never complete explanation. The accumulation of these gifts filled me with conflicting emotions that kept me awake through long mountain nights. Wonder at the creativity and effort they represented, fear of the implications they carried about the nature of what I'd been communing with, and a growing sense that I was being inducted into something ancient that demanded more than I understood. The pieces felt increasingly like invitations, or perhaps warnings, and their presence in my cabin transformed the space, made it feel less like refuge and more like threshold between worlds, between the human life I'd abandoned and something else entirely. I found myself speaking to them during dark hours, asking questions they couldn't answer, confessing that I felt unequal to whatever purpose was unfolding, admitting that part of me wanted to flee back to civilization while another part never wanted to leave this mountain, this communion, this strange healing that had grown between me and the impossible. In my dreams, the symbols moved and rearranged themselves, trying to form meanings just beyond my comprehension, and I'd wake, gasping with the certainty that understanding hovered just out of reach, that if I could only shift my perception slightly, I'd grasp truths that would change everything. The rational part of my mind that had once engineered solutions to concrete problems fought desperately against the tide of mystical thinking, but the evidence sat carved in wood and stone, undeniable, demanding acknowledgement. Everything crystallized the morning I found a particularly elaborate carving, a human figure standing beside a larger figure that could only represent the creature, both rendered in surprising detail with what appeared to be a symbol connecting their chests, some mark of bond or exchange. I was studying this piece with trembling hands when I heard the vehicle approaching, the first human sound besides my own voice I'd heard in months, and panic seized me as a truck pulled into my clearing carrying Elena Whitehorse, the elder from the Lummi Nation whose territory bordered the wilderness where I'd built my life. She visited twice a year to check on the isolated souls living in these mountains, bringing news and supplies and a connection to human community I usually tolerated more than welcomed. But today, her arrival felt like catastrophe, like my secret world was about to be exposed and judged and destroyed by outside interpretation. I quickly gathered the carvings from my table, intending to hide them, but Eleanor's eyes tracked the movement with sharp interest as she stepped from her truck, and I knew with sinking certainty that she'd already seen too much, that my carefully guarded mystery was about to be dragged into words and explanations I wasn't ready to speak. She didn't greet me with her usual casual warmth, but instead walked directly to where I stood, her weathered face grave, with an expression I couldn't read, something between concern and recognition that made my chest tighten with apprehension. "How long have you been receiving the guardian marks?" she asked without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of someone who already knew the answer but needed confirmation, and the question hit me like physical force because it named what I'd been experiencing, gave it context that both explained and terrified. I tried to deflect, to minimize, but she raised her hand in a gesture that silenced my protests and asked to see what I'd been hiding, her tone leaving no room for refusal, carrying an authority that came from knowledge I desperately needed but feared to possess. When I finally reluctantly brought out the collection of carved stones and wooden totems, spreading them across my table like evidence at a trial, Elena's sharp intake of breath confirmed my worst suspicions. These weren't curiosities or anomalies, but something recognized, something that meant more than I'd imagined, something that carried implications I'd been avoiding. Elena moved among the carvings with reverent care, her weathered fingers hovering over each piece without quite touching them, as though the objects held power that demanded respect and caution in equal measure. Her eyes traced the symbols with recognition that made my stomach clench, and twice she murmured words in her language that sounded like prayers, or perhaps warnings, acknowledging something present I couldn't see, but increasingly felt pressing against the cabin walls. Finally, she straightened and fixed me with a gaze that seemed to look through my defenses to the grief-hollowed core I'd carried into these mountains 40 years ago, seeing everything I'd tried to bury beneath isolation and ritual. "These are the kinship marks," she said, quietly, her voice carrying sorrow and wonder mingled together until I couldn't distinguish which emotion dominated her tone. "My grandmother's grandmother spoke of them, taught us the stories that most consider legend now, tales of the forest guardians who sometimes choose a human soul in darkness and draw them into sacred bond." She paused, letting the words settle like snow, accumulating into something that would eventually become impossible to move through. The beings that walk between worlds, that tend the wild places and keep balance we've forgotten how to maintain. They occasionally adopt someone, usually a person who's been broken by loss, someone who's shed their old life completely and can be remade. The statement hung between us with terrible weight, because she'd just described exactly what I'd been when I first arrived here, suicidal and empty, a hollowed vessel ready to be filled with new purpose or simply dissolved into the wilderness. "But Marcus," she continued, using my name like an anchor trying to hold me to human identity, "the bond always demands a price, an exchange to maintain the balance they're sworn to protect." Her expression held compassion, but no comfort, the look of someone delivering news that would hurt but couldn't be softened. "When your time comes, when the Guardian judges you ready for transformation, you must offer back something precious, not possessions but essence, the core of what made you human, to be planted in the forest like a seed." The words seemed to suck oxygen from the cabin, leaving me gasping with the implications of what I'd unknowingly been moving toward through 4 decades of communion and offering. Everything suddenly recontextualized itself with horrifying clarity. The gradual isolation, the deepening bond, the way I'd slowly shed human concerns until nothing remained but this mountain and this ritual and this presence I'd fed and spoken to, like the only relationship that mattered. I'd thought I was healing, that the creature's attention had saved me from suicide by giving me purpose, but now I understood I'd been in preparation, slowly transformed from man into something else, groomed for a metamorphosis I'd never consciously agreed to, but had been accepting piece by piece with every offering. "What happens to them?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking with fear I could no longer contain. "The ones who are chosen, what do they become?" Elena's expression softened with sadness that told me she wished she didn't have to answer, that some truths brought no comfort even when they brought understanding. "The stories say they become part of the forest itself, their human memories and grief transformed into the wisdom that guides the guardians, their essence woven into the land to strengthen the boundary between worlds." She gestured toward the carvings with something like apology. "They let go of individual identity, of personal history, of everything that made them specifically themselves, and become something collective, something that serves rather than wants, that tends rather than desires. The description should have sounded beautiful, transcendent, a release from the suffering that had driven me to these mountains, but instead it felt like erasure, like the final dissolution of the man I'd been, the father who'd lost his daughter, the husband who'd failed to save his wife. Some go willingly, Eleanor added quietly, seeing it as honor and completion, but others resist when the moment comes, realizing too late they weren't ready to stop being who they were, no matter how much pain that identity carried. I turned away from her toward the window, where the forest pressed close, dense and alive with presence I could no longer pretend was imagination or wildlife or anything except what I'd always known it to be. 40 years of offerings, 40 years of one-sided conversation where I'd poured out every memory of Sarah and Emma, every regret and wish and moment of love I'd lost, speaking it all into the wilderness like confession, or perhaps like sacrifice, feeding the creature not just venison, but my very history. The thought rose. Unbidden and terrible, had I been gradually giving away the essence Elena described, offering it piece by piece until nothing remained but the husk of who I'd been, ready to be transformed because I'd already emptied myself of everything that mattered. When does it happen? I asked without turning around, my breath fogging the window glass. When do they come to claim what I owe? Eleanor's footsteps approached until she stood beside me, both of us staring into the trees, where shadows moved with intention that could no longer be dismissed. The 40th year is traditional, she said softly, and my blood went cold because we were 3 months past the 40th anniversary of my arrival. 3 months into whatever window of transformation the creature had been waiting for. On the exact day you first received their attention, they'll come to complete the bond, to offer you the choice. Though the stories suggest that by the time the moment arrives, the choice has usually already been made through years of small surrenders. She placed her hand on my shoulder with grandmother gentleness. You need to decide, Marcus, who you still are and whether that person is ready to stop existing. Because once you take the Guardian's hand, there's no return to human life, no reclaiming of the identity you'll release. After Elena left with promises to return and warnings to consider. Carefully what I wanted, I sat among the carvings as afternoon light faded and tried to remember who Marcus Henderson had been before the mountain claimed him. The man who'd worked as an engineer, who'd coached his daughter's soccer team, who'd made his wife laugh with terrible puns over Sunday breakfast. That person felt fictional now, a character I'd once played, but could no longer inhabit convincingly. 40 years had stripped away those roles layer by layer until only the grief remained, the love that had nowhere to go except into ritual and offering, poured out to a creature that had perhaps been collecting it like payment against the debt I'd been accumulating. I should have felt angry at the manipulation, the way I'd been shaped without consent toward a purpose I'd never chosen, but instead I felt only a terrible clarity about how willingly I'd participated, how eagerly I'd shed my human life because it hurt too much to carry. The creature hadn't stolen me. I'd been offering myself all along, seeking dissolution, wanting to become something that didn't remember how Emma's hand felt in mine or how Sarah's voice sounded saying my name. Part of me recognized this as the final temptation, the last seduction toward oblivion, dressed up as transcendence and sacred purpose. But another part whispered that maybe transformation was the only honest end to a journey that had always been about escaping the unbearable weight of being Marcus Henderson. The carvings watched me with their spiraling symbols that I now understood were maps or perhaps recipes for how to unmake a human soul, and outside the window the forest hummed with presence that had been patient for 40 years but wouldn't wait forever. The morning of The 40th anniversary arrived with snow falling in thick silence that muffled the world into something between waking and dreaming, transforming the familiar landscape into territory that belonged neither to earth nor sky, but existed in the liminal space where choices that cannot be unmade wait to be spoken aloud. I prepared the offering as I had every Sunday for 4 decades, but my hands trembled as I arranged the smoked venison and winter berries, knowing this ritual had become the only prayer I truly believed in, the single thread of meaning I'd woven through years that might otherwise have dissolved into mere survival. The forest watched with an attention so focused I could feel it pressing against my skin like temperature change before a storm. And I understood without being told that today would bring the culmination Elena had warned about, the moment when patience transformed into invitation, and I would have to answer with more than the half-life I'd been living. As I carried the offering toward the flat stone, I found myself speaking aloud the way I always did, but this time addressing not just the presence, but myself, trying to name what I actually wanted beneath the fear and confusion that had characterized every major decision since loss had broken me open 40 years ago. "I don't know if I'm ready," I said to the watching trees, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. "But I don't know if I was ever meant to be ready, or if readiness is even what this requires." I set the offering down and turned to head back to the cabin, but movement at the tree line froze me mid-step as the creature finally emerged fully into view, no longer hiding in shadow or glimpsed through branches, but standing, complete and impossible in the morning light. It towered nearly 9 feet tall, covered in fur that seemed to shift between brown and silver, and something that looked like moss and shadow woven together, its face both animal and profoundly other, holding features that suggested ancient human lineage transformed by centuries into something the forest itself might have dreamed. But it was the eyes that struck me motionless, dark and depthless, holding an intelligence that made me feel seen in ways I'd avoided for most of my life, reflecting back not just my surface, but the grief architecture I'd built my entire existence around, the shrine to loss I'd tended more faithfully than any living relationship. The creature moved with grace that defied its massive frame, approaching slowly with hands extended in a gesture that somehow conveyed both offering and request. And I realized it was giving me time to choose, to run if I needed to reject what had been building between us through 4 decades of silent communion. Its mouth opened and a sound emerged, not words but something deeper, a resonance that vibrated in my chest and seemed to communicate directly with whatever part of me existed beneath language, beneath identity, beneath the name Marcus Henderson that had become more burden than belonging. Understanding flooded through me without words, carried on that resonant hum that felt like recognition rather than instruction, and I suddenly comprehended what the creature was actually offering. Not erasure, but transformation, not death, but a different kind of continuation, where the love I'd carried for Sarah and Emma wouldn't be lost, but would become something that nourished rather than tortured, that gave life instead of slowly consuming mine. The grief that had defined me for 40 years didn't need to disappear. It needed to be planted like the seed Eleanor described, returned to the forest that had held me when I had nothing else, transformed into the very compassion and protection this guardian offered to broken things that wandered into its territory. I thought of the wounded deer it had dragged to my cabin, the medicinal roots that had saved me from fever, the branches that had warned me away from danger, and recognized my own story in those gestures. I had been the wounded thing it had tended, and now I was being offered the chance to tend others in turn, to let my specific suffering become general mercy. The creature took another step closer, and I could smell earth and pine and something ancient beyond naming, could feel the invitation like gravity pulling me toward a destiny I'd been circling since the first winter, when mysterious footprints had made me feel less alone. Its hand extended fully now, massive and gentle, offering not just transformation but purpose, asking if I was ready to stop carrying my grief as private burden and let it become shared wisdom, to honor Sarah and Emma not through endless mourning, but through becoming someone who protected others from the darkness that had nearly consumed me. I stepped forward and placed my hand in the creature's palm, feeling warmth and roughness like tree bark, like the mountain itself, reaching out to claim what I'd been offering in pieces for 40 years. Light bloomed around us, not harsh but golden and green like sun through leaves, like the forest itself was acknowledging a contract completed, a transformation accepted, and I felt something shift in my chest as if the architecture of self was gently being dismantled and rebuilt into a structure that could hold more than just my own story. The creature's eyes held mine with tenderness that made tears stream down my face, but they were clean tears, releasing rather than clinging, letting go of the man who had fled here broken while honoring what that brokenness had taught me about survival and stubborn hope. I thought I would feel afraid as the light grew brighter and the forest seemed to breathe us both into its ancient rhythm, but instead I felt peace settling like snow, covering the jagged edges of 4 decades with something soft enough to finally rest beneath. My last, coherent thought as Marcus Henderson was gratitude for the creature's impossible patience, for Elena's honesty, for Sarah and Emma, whose love had been real enough to sustain me even in their absence, and for the mountain that had given me time to heal enough to choose transformation rather than simply surrendering to oblivion. The transformation didn't happen all at once like I'd imagined, but unfolded in layers like seasons changing, each one stripping away something I'd thought was essential until I discovered the core beneath had always been there, waiting to emerge. My body didn't disappear, but became something else, still Marcus in memory, but expanded into a form that could move through the forest without disturbing it, that could sense the heartbeat of wounded things miles away, that no longer felt separate from the trees and stone, but woven into their ancient conversation. The creature that had been my silent companion for 40 years stayed beside me through those first disorienting days, teaching without words how to read the forest's language, how to recognize suffering in the way birds fell silent or how snow lay across certain paths, how to offer help that honored rather than intruded on the dignity of broken things trying to survive. I learned that being a guardian wasn't about fixing or saving, but about presence, showing up consistently for whatever stumbled into our territory, seeking refuge, offering just enough help to make survival possible while respecting the hard work of healing that no one could do for another. The weight in my chest that had been grief for 40 years didn't vanish, but transformed into something like ballast, giving me stability and depth, helping me recognize the specific signature of loss in others, because I'd mapped every contour of my own. Time felt different now, less like a river carrying me away from Sarah and Emma, and more like a vast space where all moments existed simultaneously. I could hold their memory without being crushed by their absence, could honor what we'd shared while fully inhabiting this strange new purpose. The first time I encountered another broken soul in the forest, I understood why the creature had chosen me, why 40 years of grief had been apprenticeship rather than waste. A woman had wandered off trail during a winter storm, hypothermic and delirious, muttering about how everyone would be better off without her, and I recognized the specific flavor of that despair, like tasting my own blood. I led her to shelter without showing myself fully, left firewood and dried food, stayed close enough that she'd feel presence without threat, and watched as she chose survival, one shivering hour at a time. When rangers found her 3 days later, she told them about dreams, of a guardian angel, about feeling inexplicably safe despite being lost. And I understood this was the work, not grand gestures, but quiet tending, making sure the desperate and lost knew they weren't completely alone in the darkness. Over months and years I encountered others, a suicidal teenager who'd hiked up to jump, an elderly man who'd wandered from memory care, hunters who'd injured themselves miles from help, and each time I offered what the creature had offered me, patient presence, practical help, and the subtle message that someone was paying attention, that their existence mattered enough for the mountain itself to notice. Sarah would have loved this work, I realized, would have recognized it as the extension of the compassion she'd shown everyone from strangers to wounded animals, and that understanding felt like blessing rather than pain. Emma would have asked 1,000 questions about what it felt like to be part of the forest, would have wanted to know everything about the transformation, and I felt her. Curiosity living on in how I approached this strange new existence, with wonder rather than resignation, with eagerness to understand rather than just endure. Seasons cycled, and I stopped counting them, stopped measuring time in human years, and started recognizing it in broader patterns. The return of certain birds, the rhythm of avalanche and regrowth, the way the forest itself breathed through cycles I'd never noticed when I was still bound by mortal urgency. The original creature appeared occasionally, checking on me the way I now checked on broken things, and I understood we were part of a lineage stretching back centuries, guardians who'd each been chosen because their suffering had carved them deep enough to hold others' pain without drowning. I wondered sometimes about the choice I'd made, whether Marcus Henderson's life could have held other possibilities if I'd returned to the human world, but those thoughts came without regret. More like curiosity about a path not taken than grief over loss. The indigenous elder, Elena, had been right about balance and return. I'd given back my human form, my normal lifespan, my chance at ordinary happiness, and received in exchange this strange immortality of purpose, this existence that felt like finally paying forward the patience that had saved me. Other guardians existed in other territories, I came to understand, each one a transformed soul who'd been broken enough to appreciate the value of simple presence, who'd been loved enough to know how to offer it. We didn't communicate often, but recognized each other in subtle signs, a certain arrangement of stones, a particular pattern of protected spaces, the way certain parts of wilderness felt tended rather than merely wild. On what would have been my 70th birthday by human reckoning, I found myself standing at the flat stone where I'd left offerings for 40 years, and the symmetry felt like poetry, from broken man leaving desperate prayers to guardian maintaining the ritual in reverse. I left tokens now for those who might stumble into this territory, seeking what I'd sought. Small cairns marking safe paths, sheltered spots stocked with emergency supplies, and the intangible offering of attention, the promise that this particular stretch of mountain wouldn't let suffering go completely unwitnessed. The snow fell soft and steady, covering my tracks as I moved back into the forest, and I thought of Sarah and Emma not with the crushing weight that had defined decades, but with gratitude for how loving them had taught me the shape of my own heart, had given me capacity to care about strangers' survival with the same fierce tenderness I'd once reserved for family. They were part of this work, woven into every soul I helped through dark winters, every broken thing I tended until it was strong enough to continue alone. The forest had taken my grief and transformed it into protection, had accepted my offering of self and returned it as purpose, and I finally understood that some bargains aren't losses, but exchanges that honor both what's released and what's received. I was no longer Marcus Henderson, the grieving father and husband, but I was something that carried their love forward, that made their brief lives matter in ways that rippled outward through decades and strangers and the simple mercy of helping lost things find their way home. Would you let your grief become a gift if something ancient offered you transformation? Subscribe to witness more encounters where the mysterious and human collide.